Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So today we're going to be talking about a problem that many meditators have experienced in the course of their meditation career, and that is sleepiness. In particular, we're talking about the Pachalayamana Sutta, which describes Mahamoggallana's struggles with drowsiness. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about Mahamoggallana's path to awakening. So, of course, we know that Mahamoggallana was one of the chief disciples of the Buddha, together with Venerable Sariputta. But he wasn't born with that name. He was actually named as a young man. His name was Kolita, and he was born on the same day as the person who would eventually become Venerable Sariputta, whose lay name was Upatissa. So they grew up in the vicinity of Rajagaha. Kolita, he was born in a town called Kolitigama. And they were born to wealthy families. They would have had sort of the suitable education for somebody of their class. But because they were wealthy, they didn't have a lot of responsibilities. And so they became the leaders. Each of them became a leader of a group of friends. Now the two of them themselves were best friends, but they each had a group that sort of followed them. And so they would practice archery and horseback riding and swimming, and probably they would practice various kinds of wrestling and different kinds of fighting, whatever young boys would do in wealthy young boys would have done in ancient India. Now, if you've ever been to India, you know that Rajagaha, which was the capital of the kingdom of Magadha, Rajagaha is surrounded by hills. And so these are old mountains that are fairly eroded. They're not that high. They're kind of sandy. They have a lot of scree on them. Scree, like loose rock. And so every year they would have a festival. They called it the Hilltop Festival. And all of the people from the area would go to Rajagaha to attend this Hilltop Festival. So we have some kinds of descriptions in the different suttas about the kinds of activities people would engage in during these kinds of festivals. So they would have had activities like mimes. They would have had play fighting, acrobats. They had different kinds of music, different kinds of percussion. They had certain performers that would perform clapping and thumping. They probably would have had fortune tellers. They would have had music. And of course, they would have had drinking and all kinds of different things, different kinds of shows. Probably a little bit like an old vaudeville show. And so this year, they must have been coming of age. Maybe they were in their late teens or early 20s. But they had not yet married. They were quite occupied with their friends and playing around. They hadn't really decided to get married. They weren't that interested in marriage. So they decided to go to the Hilltop Festival. And on the first day, they attended all the shows, and it was wonderful. They saw the fire eaters and the sword swallowers and the wrestlers, and then the beautiful dancers and the singers performing these shows. As they still do in Sri Lanka, they perform. They have these shows where they'll use pictures to depict the Jataka stories, and then if it's not at a monastery, maybe they'll have music accompanying the stories, and you can see some of the dramatizations that happened later. For example, in the Buddha Charita, it tells the story of the Buddha in sort of a very dramatic fashion. It's a long poem by Ashwagosha. And so the first night they stayed there. They didn't go back to their home villages. The second day they attended the fair again. And this time something was different. Now, really there shouldn't have been any problem, but something didn't feel right. And each of them independently, when they're going and they're seeing the different shows and the wrestlers and the women dancing and singing, they just couldn't get the same kind of joy that they got the first day. And then so they went back and thought about the situation, and they realized that even though that it's a really fun thing to do to go to this kind of a fair, but you can't go to fairs all the time. And these performers, then they're telling these stories about rebirth and karma and about curses and all kinds of things. But none of them are free from those things. All of these performers are going to get old, they're going to get sick, they're going to pass away eventually. And so it started to seem quite hollow. And so when the two friends came back together, they could see there's something different. And so they asked each other, so today you don't look so happy. Yesterday you were enjoying yourself. What's changed? And so they reported the situation. They talked about their reflections. And they said, well, if that's the case, if we should seek a different kind of happiness, a happiness that is free, that is beyond sensual pleasures, a happiness we can enjoy that won't be dependent on these kinds of impermanent and inherently not fully satisfactory things. So they went off searching for a teacher. In ancient India, of course, they had different kinds of wandering sects. So they had, for example, the Ajivikas who would go completely naked. They had quite a few. They had different sects that would go around completely naked. Some would go around wearing loincloths, or they would be dressed in antelope hide or owl wings. If you go to India today, you can see some different kinds of ascetics with long dreadlocks wrapped around their head. Some of them wearing orange-colored robes, a little bit similar to the Buddhist monks, but they often will have paint on their face or something like that. So they had a tremendous variety. They're very much a part of society. This is something that two young men in ancient India might think to do. It's not sort of beyond the realm of possibility that they would have known about these different kinds of people doing meditation and severe ascetic practices, sitting out in the sun and things like that. So they looked for a teacher, and the teacher they found was named Sanjaya Balattaputta. So Sanjaya was teaching a doctrine of what we would say radical skepticism. And you can see some sort of representation of his view in the Sammanyapala Sutta, in the Digha Nikaya. But generally, he wouldn't take a stand on the main philosophical issues of the day, just to put it in a short summary. And so if somebody would ask him, well, what do you think about this? He'd say, I don't say it's so, I don't say it's not so, I don't say it's not so. So he would avoid taking a stand on these issues. And the way it's portrayed in the Digha Nikaya, it seems a very foolish view, but there must have been some kind of intellectual satisfaction to it. Otherwise, two very intelligent young men like Venerable Sariputta and Mahamoggallana, they wouldn't have seen anything of interest there. So when they decided to go and join his group, their friends actually joined them. So in total, there were 250 followers. But again, after some time, they started to think, well, we've been with Sanjaya, our teacher Sanjaya, for a certain amount of time, but we're still not fully satisfied. So they went to ask him, is this everything that you teach? And he said, yes, this is everything. This is what we teach. Now you have learned everything. And so they they realized, well, that's not really what we gave up our families for. We didn't go forth to learn about radical skepticism. We're trying to attain freedom from all suffering. So they went off in different directions, and they made the agreement that after going off, the first one who finds the deathless, then he would come back and inform the other. So as we know, the story is Venerable, our young Upatissa, who would become Venerable Sariputta, then he heard a teaching. He saw Venerable Asaji going on alms round, and he became quite inspired by that, and following him around, and Venerable Asaji gave him a very pithy teaching, and I'll quote it now in the Pali here. Ye dhamma hetu pabbhava te sanghetun tathagato aha te sanchayo nirodho evang vadi mahasamano. So translated as, of those phenomena that originate from a cause, the Tathagata has declared the cause, and also what their cessation is. This is the doctrine of the great recluse. So when young Upatissa heard this verse, and he was able to attain stream entry, and at that point he realized he had to fulfill his obligation to inform young Kolita that he had found the path to the deathless. And so he did, and reciting the verse, young Kolita also was able to attain stream entry. So famously, they both go back to see their teacher Sanjaya Balattaputta. Before going to see the Buddha, they go to see their old teacher to invite him to switch his allegiance, to come and listen to the Buddha's teachings. And famously, Sanjaya Balattaputta, he refuses. He says that he asks them that he says that he's been a teacher for a long time. It would be very difficult to become a student again. And he asked them the question, in this world, are there more fools or wise people? And they answered, of course, there are more fools in the world. And he said, well, in that case, let the fools come to me for teachings, and then let the wise people go to the Buddha. So Venerable Sariputta and Mahamoggallana, still Upatissa and Kolita, they went off to meet the Buddha with their 250 followers, and Sanjaya stayed back. Now, at this point, they meet the Buddha in the bamboo grove, and he gives them a teaching, and their followers were able to attain arahantship, hearing his teachings. But Upatissa and Kolita, now they've been ordained. They were ordained as Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Mahamoggallana. They went off to practice on their own. Now Mahamoggallana was practicing with great effort, and the commentary mentions that he was practicing walking meditation continuously for 7 days, and because of that he became quite sleepy. And so then this sutta, this Pachalayamana Sutta, it means nodding off. And so the Buddha would periodically check on his disciples with his psychic powers. And so the Buddha sent a projection of himself to Mahamoggallana and gave these instructions here. This is in the Anguttara Nikaya in the Sevens, and it's Sutta number 61. So we're going to follow Ajahn Sujato's translation from Sutta Central. Now, actually, this sutta, it's not that short. It has several sections. And it said that at the end of the sutta, Mahamoggallana was able to attain arahantship. But we're especially looking at this issue of sleepiness. Now, many meditators find it to be a very troublesome obstacle to their meditation. And one reason is that for some people, when they're meditating and their energy drops and they start to feel drowsy, they can't really control what kinds of thoughts come into their head. And so then they can start to, in a sort of very dull way, they can start to mull over problems in their life, or they can get memories from the past that start to disturb them. Some people, they just go into a dull state, and they don't realize that they become very drowsy, and they don't realize that their meditation is not progressing anymore. And suddenly they hear a bell, they realize, oh, I've been sleeping for the last 20 minutes or whatever. So of course, Mahamoggallana, he is practicing with great effort. And so the Buddha gives him, he gives him some advice here. So the first one, are you nodding off, Moggallana? Are you nodding off? Yes, sir. So, Moggallana, don't focus on or cultivate the perception that you were meditating on when you felt drowsy. It's possible that you'll give up drowsiness in this way. So, essentially, you should do something else. So, if he was practicing anapanasati, or if he was practicing meditation on the four elements in the body, then perhaps he should switch to some uplifting theme, for example, Buddhanusati. Or he could switch between the two of them. If he had been practicing Buddhanusati, he could practice anapanasati. Try switching the object or whichever theme of meditation that you're practicing. Now, there are some meditation objects that tend to be more suitable to this. So the ones that tend to activate the mind can be more helpful. So for example, following the breath, if one starts to feel drowsy, starting to count the breaths, the ins and the out breaths, might be very helpful. So there are different methods of that. One way is to just count 1 with the in-breath, and 1 with the out-breath, and 2 with the in-breath, 2 with the out-breath. Counting like that up to 8 or 9 or 10 breaths, and then count backwards. So then count from 8 back down to 1. Some people find it more helpful to count the breaths more actively. So instead of 1 for the in-breath, they'll count sort of the number of beats. So 1, 2, 3, and for the out-breath, 2, 2, 3, and then with the in-breath, 1, 2, 3, and with the out-breath, 2, 2, 3. Here the main method is to overcome drowsiness. So either method would be perfectly fine. Some people find that practicing recollection of the Buddha's qualities quite quickly can be very helpful. But we haven't taught the different meditation objects, so whichever meditation object that you know, whichever one that you find activates the mind more is suitable for this purpose. And the Buddha will give some further advice here. But what if that doesn't work? Then think about and consider the teaching as you've learned and memorized it, examining it with your mind. It is possible that you'll give up drowsiness in this way. So think about the teaching, consider it in the way that you've memorized it. And so this is one of the reasons why we very much encourage some Dhamma study in addition to pure meditation practice. It's very useful to have some good knowledge of the Dhamma. And one of the reasons is if your meditation is not going well, you're very drowsy, then you can think about it. And sometimes it just helps to activate the mind. And sometimes you can find other solutions. You can understand different problems about your meditation. Usually, for traditional Buddhists who are practicing chanting every day, it's helpful to choose one of the Paritta chants that they enjoy. So for example, some people might be chanting the Anattalakkana Sutta, the second sutta that the Buddha preached at Isipatana in Varanasi. And some people might like to chant the Jagga Sutta. The Buddha gives advice to the monks how to avoid fear when they're practicing in the forest. Some people might like to contemplate the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the first sutta that he preached to the 5 ascetics in Varanasi, that it outlines the Noble Eightfold Path. So whichever sutta you find interesting, whatever teaching you find interesting, and that you're familiar with enough that you can turn over in your mind, because this is an active process. It's a thinking process. So don't forget that thinking is something that the Buddha recommends that we do as part of the practice. It's not something that we need to do all of the time. There are definitely parts of the meditation that are geared towards overcoming thinking, but at this particular instance, he's recommending thinking. But if that doesn't work, then recite in detail the teaching as you've learned it and memorized it. It's possible that you'll give up drowsiness in this way. So reciting the teaching, this works if you're alone. So if you're on a meditation retreat, if you're with a large group of people, then please don't start chanting. But if you're alone and you're feeling drowsy in your morning meditation, you can keep a chanting book next to you. If you've memorized some chants, if you know the Itipiso Bhagava Arahang Samma Sambuddho Vijja Charana Sampanno Sukito Lokavidu, if you know some of these verses, then you can chant them. And again, it's very helpful if you've memorized some, but if not, it's quite all right to keep the book next to you, and you can just do some of the chanting there. Again, please choose a chant that you enjoy. So if you're very familiar with the Burmese tradition, they like to chant Patana, this Heitu Pachyo, Aramana Pachyo, Adipati Pachyo, Anantara Pachyo, Samanantara Pachyo. And this is an Abhidhamma, a description of different kinds of links of causation, causal links. In Sri Lanka, they're very fond of chanting Ratana Sutta or Mahamangala Sutta, Karaniya Sutta. So whichever you're more familiar with, whichever you prefer, you can try chanting that. And this is quite effective. Quite often you'll be able to overcome your drowsiness in this way. But if that doesn't work, then pinch your ears and rub your limbs. Pinch your ears and rub your limbs. So you see this sometimes in a meditation hall. As somebody has become very drowsy, you'll see them pulling on their ears and rubbing their limbs, trying to increase the blood flow. So you can notice that this is something that can be done in the seated posture. So you can try other things, maybe opening and closing your fists. This is another method. Something that is quiet and doesn't disturb the posture. But if that doesn't work, then get up from your seat, flush your eyes with water, look around in every direction, and look up at the stars and constellations. So depending on where you are, this is assuming more like you're meditating alone, probably with access to the stars and the constellations. So you're outdoors in more of a rural environment. So you splash your face with water. Of course, it's a classic way to try to wake yourself up. If you splash it all over your head, sometimes people wet their hair. They find that it's very uncomfortable to have wet hair. Or if you have a shaved head, some people find cold water on the head to be a brisk way to wake oneself up. And then to look up at the stars. Now, for those of you who live in cities and in Western countries, then maybe you're not that familiar with the stars, but the sky can be quite bright at night. If you're living in a place without so much light pollution, you can see a lot of things in the sky. So the Buddha recommends to pay attention to those for a few minutes and try to wake yourself up. But if that doesn't work, then apply your mind to the perception of light, focusing on the perception of day, as by day, so by night, as by night, so by day. And so, with an open and unenveloped heart, develop a mind that's full of radiance. It is possible that you give up drowsiness in this way. So, paying attention to the perception of light this is the internal. So this meditator has already paid attention to light externally by opening the eyes and looking at the stars or the moon or whatever kind of light is around. Of course, they're presuming your drowsiness is happening at night. If it's during the daytime, when open one's eyes, you can just look around. So this is not as easy for beginners to pay attention to the perception of light, the perception of day. One way to do it is to recall a light. So, for example, you've seen light streaming through clouds before, sunlight streaming through clouds, and focus on that memory. And by focusing on that memory of light, then it's possible that in the mind's eye, your mind's eye might become very bright. This perception might grow and grow until you have a very bright perception in your mind. Even though your eyes are closed, it feels like it's daytime. You're not sure if it's day or night because your mind is so bright internally. So this is, if this doesn't work though, then the Buddha is recommending to change postures. So if that doesn't work, then walk mindfully, focusing on the perception of continuity, your faculties directed inwards, and your mind not scattered outside. So to change postures but not to lose your mindfulness. So to get up and do some walking meditation. And you can do walking, when you do the walking meditation, you can focus on whatever, you can continue focusing on whatever object that you've been focusing on in your sitting meditation. Or you can switch. If you have another customary way of doing walking meditation, then that's quite all right. So this one is, hopefully you won't be falling asleep in the walking posture, but it's quite possible that even though you're not falling asleep in the walking posture, your mind is still very dull, and you're not capable of focusing properly. But what if that doesn't work? Then lie down in the lion's posture on the right side, placing one foot on top of the other, mindful and aware, and focused on the time of getting up. When you wake, you should get up quickly, thinking, I will not live indulging in the pleasures of sleeping, lying down and drowsing. That's how you should train. So to lie down on your right side and sleep for a short time with this determination to get up quickly. Now, this is talking about somebody who's in a time when they're trying to meditate. Now, of course, it's necessary to sleep a certain amount at nighttime. Make sure that the body has rest. But if you've designated that time for meditation, and you're not intending to sleep for a whole night, the Buddha is recommending a short rest. And I think a lot of people have experienced that when they lie down, if they lie down with this intention, okay, well, I'll get up. As soon as I wake up, I'll get up and continue. Maybe they haven't done this with meditation, but maybe I'll get up and continue studying, or I'll get up and I'll finish my housework. Often a short rest, like a 10-minute or 15-minute rest, is enough just to refresh you for a few hours after that, sort of to get you through the meditation and get you through to the evening when it's actually time to take a longer rest. So those are the 8 methods that the Buddha is recommending here. And there are the commentary gives it another set of 5 methods, but I think 8 methods is enough for now. So if you try these, and you can try these and see how it helps your meditation. Mahamoggallana, after this, the Buddha gives him some advice about his behavior. And after that, he asks some questions about liberation, and then he's able to actually overcome his drowsiness and attain liberation. So it doesn't recount all of his practice in this sutta, but we know that he'd been walking meditation for 7 days at this point, and that the Buddha, and that he attained Arahant after 7 days. So there's a series of suttas in the Samyutta Nikaya that discuss his practice of samatha, practice of samadhi, deep concentration. We know that Mahamoggallana became the foremost of the Buddha's disciples in the psychic powers, and he was also one of the chief disciples. The 2 highest disciples of the Buddha were Venerable Sariputta and Mahamoggallana. So I hope that this advice that the Buddha gave to somebody who had some of the highest part of me in this entire sasana. I hope that this advice will also be of use to you, and that you may follow in his footsteps and attain Nibbana as swiftly as possible. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.